Well, now we will turn our attention to current trends and Indian historiography. So we will discuss few major historians who have given new directions to historiography and historical method, and then we will turn our attention to our own country, development of historiography in our own country. So we have dealt with Marx and others. Now we will be dealing with Max Weber. Born in 1864, died in 1920, Weber was a critic of Marx. Being a liberal, as opposed to the social democrats, he also rejected the new Kantian thought of the German reactionaries. In fact, he was deeply perturbed by the increasing Germanism in German universities spreading under the garb of new Kantism. Weber, thus, by his own political position, if not by anything else, was placed between Marxian and the new Kantian position. Yet his position was not a compromising one. This is remarkable. He betrays extreme originality and freshness of thought. Indeed, his contribution does not lie in taking an intermediate position, but in making insightful contributions to the field of both history and sociology. Weber's earliest works were on history, chief ones being the decline of the Roman Empire, economic history of the ancient world, general economic history. One notices even in the choice of his themes, the influence of Marx is quite evident. His most notable contribution, however, was Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. In one of the asides or footnotes of Capital, Marx had said that religious world is a reflex of the material world and that the Protestant ethics was a readjustment of the former to the changed capitalist world. Weber seeks to invest Marx, that is, in this particular instance at least, and inferentially in all such instances, it is the change in religious ideas that contributes to the spirit of capitalism, according to Weber. Weber argues that the development of capitalism was greatly, though not exclusively, influenced by Protestant ethics, particularly its Calvinistic values. Marx, he said, was wrong in saying that capitalism was a mode of production in which wage labor is exploited. It is, according to him, in fact, a rational method of economic organization keyed to the market for acquisition by individuals. Thus, rationalism, market, acquisitiveness, and individualism are the basics to capitalism, and exploitation is secondary. He is not putting so much emphasis on exploitation or labor theory of value. Protestantism supports capitalism for the following reasons, according to him. One, because it insists on the individual. Second, because it stretches rationalism by an excessive simplification of religion. And third, by stressing the importance of saving now for reward in the other world, which Adam Smith and others were calling compensation for your savings. He is saying for the other world. It underlines acquisitiveness. The spirit of capitalism, he says, is geared not for consumption but for accumulation. Capitalist accumulation of wealth is in line or a natural extension of the virtue of Calvinistic accumulation of good deeds. Incidentally, it may be said here that it was later left to Keynes to point out that if everybody accumulates in a society, then capitalist system would collapse. Capitalism to survive needs both the spirits of accumulation as well as consumption. The weakness of Max Weber does not lie in his understanding of Protestantism, but in his understanding of the spirit of capitalism. It can be seen that in seeking to reject Marx, he has had to redefine capitalism as a spirit of rationalism. And thus, in doing so, he fails to demarcate or quietly ignores the historical difference between the age of scientific revolution and the age of capitalism. It is in fact by offering such a weak definition of capitalism that he manages to refute Marx's contention that it was Protestant ethics which adjusted to capitalist spirit and not vice versa. Weber recognized that economic phenomenon was important, no doubt. Here he takes a notable departure from the new Kantians. He also agreed with Marx in viewing capitalism as an important category. Where he differed from Marx was between the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism, and by its extension between religion and material conditions. As mentioned earlier, he believed that Protestantism was not a sequence of capitalism, but it was the latter which led much to the former. One can clearly notice that he took up the same problems that had been the main concern of Marx and Engels, but of course answered them differently within quote. The other major point of contention between Marx and Weber is on the former's class-oriented interpretation of history and society. Much of the Marxian view of the world, says Weber, is derived from conditions created by capitalism. Many of the phenomenon, especially the phenomenon of class divisions and class struggle, which Marx treats universal in all times and for all regions, were a creation of the capitalist world. A class, he says, is a group with identical economic interest as mediated by marketplace. Thus, a class can only arise after money economy becomes all pervasive and customary relations give way to market relations, that is feudal relations give way to market relations. Both for exchange of property and for sale of labor, one has to go to the market. Under the previous system, exchange of property was not possible because that was not in their hands. So, prior to this development, or say prior to capitalist growth, there can exist no class but only status. In other words, by defining class in terms of money relations and market forces, Weber decidedly reduces the entire Marxian interpretation to modern times. Classes and class struggles came into being not when surplus was generated, as Marx had held and explained, but only when capitalism came into being, according to Weber. Before classes came into being, the society was organized on the basis of status, which in turn was determined by custom. Conflicts largely would arise not around economic interest, but around the needs, requirements and constraints of custom. Such societies which are governed by customs were termed by Weber as capitalism. As mentioned earlier, was defined by Max Weber as a system of acquisitiveness keyed to marketplace, which in turn is keyed to rational calculations. Thus, in capitalist societies, custom gets replaced by rational calculations, which were defined as calculations of profit based on one's understanding of market forces. Rationality, in other words, depends on profit motive, which in turn depends on one's understanding of what is good for oneself. Thus, rationalism depends on pure individualism. One might disagree with his considering absolute individualism as a rational concept, but it is with this value of rationality as defined by Weber that he seeks to identify capitalism. In pre-capitalist societies, rationality was absent. People fought and yearned for honor, power and prestige, not for profits and gains. Their values were different, for they were largely determined by a series of beliefs, not by a series of rational, that is profitable calculations. This took him to the question of the identification of a society. While Marx identified a society by its mode of production, it is the values of a particular society that distinguishes and identifies one society from another. Values in all societies, according to Weber, have immense variability but can still be identified and demarcated from each other by their underlying and broad similarities. The tendency of the modern world, he goes on, is to reduce these values to single individualism, which is the dominant, though not the sole value of capitalist culture. Neo-Kantians had said that these values were independent of human endeavor and had more to do in their origins with some kind of a supernatural force. Weber, by arguing in favor of their immense variability, rejects the neo-Kantian position. Yet at the same time, he rejected the Marxist position that these values were the realization of social reality. That is to say, they originated from material conditions. He therefore, perhaps unconsciously, left the door open for neo-Kantism. He furthermore asserts that in studying a culture, a scholar should be value-free. That is, investigation should not be partisan and should begin with no prior assumptions. There is, his prescribing for historical method. This indeed is a very harsh condition placed on the social scientist. His quest for study of social change took him to the societies of India and China. Confronted with explaining the lack of capitalist growth in Indian society, he took refuge in the caste system. He explained that caste system is responsible for it, as prevalent in it since ancient times. The principal value in India, he says, is the doctrine of karma, since it enjoins one to totally conform to custom and thus to the caste system. Caste system renders the society totally immobile. The system, however, is operational because skills are transferred, but at the same time it lacks potentialities of growth. Since in it mobility is restricted and therefore one sees complete absence of competition. That is, according to Weber. Chinese society, he says, was unchanging because of the Confucian values of family and obedience. While indeed his observations on both, Indian and Chinese civilizations are totally erroneous by our present day knowledge, his main contribution lies in raising the questions that he did and in recognizing that no conceptual framework of sociology and history could be propounded without keeping the focus on the entire world. Max Weber is also known for propounding certain very important ideas and terms. One such term very much in vogue today is legitimacy state, which he says is a combination of territoriality with dominance. This dominance is not achieved by force but also significantly by its legitimacy. That is, the concept propounded by subjects that dominance is legitimate. He gave a large number of instances of states with pure reliance on force, but also cites few examples which claimed legitimacy in the eyes of the subjects. In traditional societies, religion is one of important source of legitimacy. The other is charisma, another term put in vogue by Weber. That is, achievements of some time are considered so outstanding that his role, that of his descendants or of his state, are regarded as making their claim to sovereignty legitimate and even desirable. Weber's analysis does not constitute a comprehensive system. He himself insisted that he was not establishing a system, but only providing a framework on which a system could be established. He is in fact an answer to both Marx and proponents of neo-Kantism. Regarding Weber, to conclude, I would say that it is wrong to say that he was against Marx. He was not against Marx. He reads Marx so carefully, and then he is adding to what he thought something original in his thinking, which we have witnessed just now. To be able to understand Marx Bloc and the Annales school, one needs to first go back to Durkheim. Durkheim was a French sociologist and a senior contemporary of Max Weber. We have already discussed Durkheim. He is not concerned with the questions raised by Marx and betrays almost no influence of Marx in his writings. He in turn takes off from Augustus Comte, 1798-1857. This gentleman also we have discussed in detail. Marc Bloch was born in 1886 in France, in Strasbourg, Alsace-Lorraine, which had been captured by Germany in 1871 and recovered back by France in 1918. I am just giving you the historical background of it. Quite early in the age, he became a professor at Strasbourg, 1919. Though not greatly interested in politics, the developments of world wars and the French defeats in the 1940s led him to voluntarily join the French resistance and became an editor of an underground paper. For these activities and also for being a Jew, he was captured by the Nazis and consequently executed in 1944. Durkheim begins by making a distinction between social facts and individual actions. That is to say, he argued that totality of individual actions do not constitute any social fact. Social facts are not constituted by statistical averages even, although he admits that they help, and since the business of a sociologist is to study the social facts, he needs to study individualism only insofar as they conform to or oppose social facts. One major social fact, he does not use values, he argues, is the feeling of solidarity. In a major work on suicides, he showed that in those areas of France where the percentage of suicides was high, saw the weak solidarities and strong individualism. Conversely, in areas where social solidarity was very high, the rate of suicide appeared low. Social solidarity, he pointed out, was high among Jews and Catholics and weak among Protestants. He also admitted that the role of economic situation in determining suicides and other human actions, where the employment is abundant and food grains cheap, man feels secure, and that is how the external phenomenon can be internalized. By internalization, he means those human feelings which respond to external situations. Social facts or institutions originally arise because they perform certain functions, but later on, even when the purpose of their existence may be over, they could continue to exist as a symbol of social facts and solidarity. His approach to his greatest concern was Marc Bloch's, because I was discussing Durkheim, just to let you know the perspective in which Marc Bloch is approaching history or historical problems. His greatest concern was the study of history of peasantry in all its forms. In 1929, he was invited to Oslo to deliver lectures on French rural history, which were later published in 1913 as Studies in French Rural History or French Rural History, an essay on its basic characteristics. Soon after his publication, he came into close contact with Lucien Lefebvre, with whom he established from 1930 onwards a journal called Annales d'Histoire économique et sociale, or more popularly known as Annales. The first title of the journal read Annals of Social and Economic History. Now it is known as Annals of Societies, Economies and Civilizations. This journal began to publish the neglected sides of history, articles on economic history, production technology, link between political history and social structure, and on what was very dear to Marc Bloch, comparative history, on which I shall be speaking separately about it. The Annals thus became a vehicle for what were regarded as innovative subjects. In 1939, Bloch completed his second major work known as Feudal Society, published in 1940, an attempt at what he described as total history. This is another major concept by Mark Bloch, introduced into history writing. This work was important for attempting towards a synthesis, so to say, between the works of German and English constitutional and political historians and the Marxist historians. But he did not simply put the Marxist interpretation alongside that of constitutional and political historians, but added to their interpretation the perspective of ideology. Ideology or beliefs of not just the church or aristocracy, though they were important for Bloch, but also that of common people, which was a neglected side. The artisans, the peasants, the landless laborers, as reflected in their folk traditions and popular songs. On the defeat of France in 1940s, he wrote another book, La étrange défaite des manières écrites en 1940, published in 1946. Translation would be Strange Defeat, La étrange défaite, a statement of evidence written in 1940. That was, however, published posthumously. While in retirement, he wrote his last book, A Historian's Craft, which is actually a compilation initiated by a dialogue between the father and the son. So under the title Land and Labor in Medieval Europe. In the preface of Land and Labor, Lucien Febvre says that Marc Bloch's approach as a historian was largely conditioned by and strongly related to his deep feelings for the common people, for the peasants and artisans. It is, says Lucien Febvre, with a justified presumption because of our deep roots in common people that we are both great. Lucien Febvre does not seem to be very wrong, for there is indeed in Marc Bloch's writings a healthy suspicion of the ruling classes and a strong feeling of deference towards peasants, workers and common men. He is very sympathetically disposed towards them. There are two major influences on Bloch, Durkheim and Marx. While the influence of these two thinkers looms in his writings, large in his writings, he regards any direct reference to Durkheim or Marx as pure theology, though indeed he admits that their influence on his approach to history. Bloch, never said in black and white that material forces carried primary importance, but his writings make clear that he regarded economic environment on what he calls human environment and the techniques of production to be essential for studying history. Like, Marx also says that. Karl Marx, 1818-1883, had rated in a note that the study of history of technology had lagged behind in Europe. By the time of Marc Bloch, however, he is dying in 1883 and this gentleman is taking birth in 1886 and continues till 1944. So, and we assume that, he must be familiar with Marx's writings. So, and they are proof of it. So, that's why I've given the time period that look here, very soon Marx's idea was, seriously applied in history writing. The same could still be said. Marx had also casually noted that watermill was an essential feature of feudalism. And Marc Bloch has written a whole article on that. Starting from this observation of Marx, Bloch set out to study the history of watermills and its relationship with the feudal societies in a famous essay, Windmill, published in Land and Labor. He notes that the ownership of windmills in medieval Europe belonged to lords. Lords means feudal lords. And seeks to establish that mill was a means of concentration of power in the hands of these lords and a tool for the extension of their strange hold over the peasantry. He therefore sees it as a mere means of exploitation of the peasantry and concentration of property income and power in the hands of their oppressors. In other words, he establishes or seeks to establish in a considerably convincing manner that windmills were an essential feature of feudalism, agreeing to what Marx had noted earlier, what was there in the insight of the Marx. In French rural history, he studies the problems of French peasantry as he himself sought to understand it. Here I would like to pinpoint that he could do it because by the time he's writing, even village level documents were gathered, and they were given due prominence in writing history. So collection of hard data, the hard data of this is concerned, French history is concerned, they were all having that. Why I am saying this? Because after getting hold of every detailed data at the macro level and at macro level, then you can think of contemplating over certain theorization. Whereas in India, you will find that this has not happened till date. We have not, collected all our data from the village level to, and brought it to a central archives. Therefore, when we are jumping upon any new school of thought, I would suggest that we should be, we should put some brake over it. Instead of jumping on the wagon, we should wait and let us, have a view of all the data like Mark Bloch had. Therefore, he notes that the ownership of windmills. Therefore, in French rural history, he studies the problems of French peasantry as he himself sought to understand it. English historians had studied French peasantry from the standpoint of view of lords, without realizing that the interests of the aristocracy were not necessarily the same as that of peasants and laborers, or even as that of agricultural production as a whole. As an example, while the British historians, taking the lord's standpoint, saw nothing particularly significant in the peasant's right to commons and his resistance against attempt to curtail or curb that right, Mark Bloch showed how important, sometimes appearing even as quite central, was this issue for the peasants and laborers. Fodder was the only means for the peasants for feeding his animals. Fights over the right of stubble were thus a major bone of contention and a cause for divisiveness or alienation, not only between the landowners and the peasants, but also between the peasants themselves. That is one of the reasons why you will find the British historians did not have a favorable opinion about the French Revolution. They are very critical. They say that if the lords are removed, because the landlords, the lords had turned into landlords by the middle of the 18th century in England after the Civil War, especially after the restoration of 1688. That is, power of parliament was recognized where the gentry was holding the power. So, the power struggle was between king and the parliament, and the king, ultimately there is a compromise, an alliance between the two, and slowly and gradually you will find that the institution of kings or the monarchy becomes very strong. And that is why they were apprehensive that if this kind of episode takes place in England, then their interest will be threatened. That's why they were very, very, very critical of French Revolution.